everyone, welcome to a new episode of the 28.4 FM podcast, where we as young people talk to you about what's been up. I'm Rishika, and today I'm joined by Abhishek. And what we're going to be discussing is something that's picked up traction recently. It's being discussed in the media somewhat, news outlets have been talking about it, people have definitely been talking about it, and that's kind of meta because what we're going to be discussing is the media itself. We're going to examine why the media is the way it is, what sort of led to it being this way, and whether it will continue to be this way. And, Abhishek's going to help us break down certain events that have taken place with regards to the media, what they really mean for the future of the news we consume, and structural reasons about why the media exists the way it does. So before we dive into the main content of this episode, Abhishek, I want to ask you two questions. The first is, where do you get your news from? And the second is, how often do you consume news?
So I'm a news junkie and I look at the news like practically almost every day and like way more frequently than just once a day. I have a new rule in my life that I have to read everything and make up my own mind based on all the different perspectives of the facts presented. So I pretty much read almost every single mainstream media source, at least in India, but also now in the US. As you know, the US is in the middle of an election campaign and has the same polarized media as India does with the same incentives.
I think, and I don't know if this is an age thing because I don't want to speak for every person in my age bracket, and I also don't want to make you feel really old. But what I found is that most people, or most of my friends I know personally, I think 95% of our news comes from a digital medium. So that might take the shape of applications of news outlets like NDTV, The Economist, TOI, or digital PDFs of newspapers. And I think that's a phenomenon that sort of picked up in quarantine. And I'm sure there's many cool people my age who, sit down and read the physical newspaper, but I don't think that's commonplace. Mostly, like you said, you read the paper page to page. I'm not sure if that's something a lot of people my age do. We'd rather just read articles on an application. And of course, the second main source on the digital medium is social media. So I might follow pages like the New York Times or, NDTV, The Wire. And I think that does go for most people my age. One phenomenon that we sort of, seen play out in real time, like if I were to give a personal example, is when I was younger, I would sit with my parents and we'd watch the news on TV in our living room. But now it's usually my mom and dad who watch it because I can't stand it. And I don't know if it's specific channels, but I cannot take the noise, and not just noise in the literal sense, but also in terms of what's being reported and how it's being reported. And I kind of want you to elaborate on that for me. But even TV news has become obsolete for most people my age. I think if I ask my friend circle, which, it's not the most representative sample, but it's fair to say that people are very disillusioned or slowly getting disillusioned by what's being reported on television media, especially when it comes to younger audiences.
Yeah, so if I were an executive of a news media channel, I would definitely be very concerned after listening to that because India is, as the theme of our podcast very clearly highlights, an extremely young country. So if you have your demographic tuning out of the news channels and not reading newspapers, I think that bodes very poorly for the future of media and its viability in the country. I completely agree with you. I'm a little older than you, but I share your tendency to look to social media to get my news, albeit with more sort of news sources where I independently actively try to look up information. But yeah, the thing with the news media is there's been a downward spiral, and it's happened over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. And then there are certain structural reasons behind it which we can go into, or rather we will go into. But let me turn that question back to you then. So is sort of Facebook and Twitter your main source of news as of now, or do you do anything else outside of that to get out of your bubble or your news feed?
I would say Twitter, Facebook. It's a fairly, it's a popular platform. I know other people my age use it. I personally don't, but
Yeah.
with Twitter, I recognize that it's a social platform first and a news platform second. So a lot of the people I follow are people who align with my political beliefs. So although
Right.
it is a source of like a great deal of new information, it's sort of information in the same circle that's confirmed by the same circle. Which is why
Right.
I've made Instagram this space where my home feed is 50 to 70% news. So I actively follow pages that report both on the left and the right, and also on the center, both India and internationally. So it's like the Hindu and also the Times and sometimes Fox and CNN. I guess that would be my source of direct social media news. But of course, news isn't just headlines and articles, it's also anecdotes and stuff like that. So, like you
Correct.
said, independent agencies and independent people themselves reporting from the ground level from a very direct perspective. I think that's definitely something that I don't consume as much as the headline side of it, but I do want to consume more because they're very few and far between. So I would say Instagram is my main source of news, and Twitter is more the social side of it.
Okay, let's come back to that, but we have to talk about the news media because regardless of what you and I do, it's still a major source of news distribution in the country. You know, and I think our listeners will find that we'll talk a little bit more about the English news media. I just want to caveat that the English news media consumption makes up just under 1% of the total news consumption in India. So the real sources of news on TV are the vernacular channels and the Hindi news channels where the where they get the most amount of viewership. But so what we need to understand is that there's such a big disconnect between what you see on primetime television on most news channels, and this is the English sensationalist news channels, and what is happening in the country. To the extent where if you're visiting India for the first time and you know nothing about what's happening in the world, you're just kind of thinking that a particular Bollywood person's suicide is the biggest news story in the country, and a particular actress's attempt to gain political fame is the most important issue worth coverage, uh, and stuff like that. And I'm just it's just bizarre that this is the situation of the news media from in our country, and it's a little scary too
Yeah.
because that means that there are plenty of things that are going wrong right now and are just not getting any mileage on primetime news. I don't know, like do you have anything to add to that?
Okay, yeah. So I don't know if this is like the most concise way to put it, but I always think if, say, aliens were to visit the planet, right, and the only way they could recognize what's going on in the world is through news channels, uh, I feel they would imagine a completely different vision of what I guess specifically our country is like. And
Right.
you put it very well. It's the focus on issues is extremely skewed, and all of these primetime channels have a massive disconnect with what's going on at the local level, what's going on with the public. But I don't know. There's sort of a cognitive dissonance, don't you think? It's like we know that India's population is in no way getting reflected by what's being covered on screen, but what else do we do? Like, what do we do about it? Why is it happening in the first place? And yeah, it's just there's this massive gap in between sort of the public's interests and the news channels coverage, and if that makes sense.
So I want to answer the why part a little bit right now. There are structural reasons for this. I don't want to get into the cultural reasons because there are many, and that's a whole separate conversation. But one of the economic reasons behind what you're seeing on the news today is the business model of these news channels. So about 15 years ago, in 2004, I believe, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, basically issued a new set of regulations that capped subscription prices for news channels. And it was a well intended policy because there was a lot of sort of non transparency in how these channels were being priced and distributed to the people. So they wanted to make sure that they were accessible to everyone.
Okay.
But the byproduct of that policy is that news channels could no longer depend on subscription revenue from their viewers to sort of cover their production costs. So what they had to do is they had to develop this parallel model dependent on advertising. So the moment you become so reliant on advertising, and just to give everyone context, 70% of our news channels revenue comes from advertising today. So if you're so dependent on advertising, then advertising dollars are a product of getting the most amount of viewers. And once you're chasing the number of views, it's a race to the bottom, and that's why you're seeing this kind of, frankly unethical, ridiculous, insane coverage of sensitive issues like mental health and suicide in this manner. But it's just completely driven by flawed economic incentives.
Yeah, the 70% statistic is really interesting. I guess if you aren't being funded by the people, you have no incentive to serve the people.
Exactly.
Something that's really been brought up recently is how the media is supposed to be the fourth pillar of democracy. But if the pillar is not standing on the base of public franchisee, why would it have the incentive to serve the public franchisee? And this does put things into perspective because we can't really blame news producers and news channels for wanting to earn money. It's their job. But like you said, the economic model in itself is flawed. So it's interesting to me that there's reserved interests in something that's supposed to be this public and transparent and accessible medium that frankly helps people in a very direct way.
Yeah, so it's all of that. And the other thing that this incentive of depending on advertising does is, there's a lot of cheating going on in terms of how they measure viewership. And that's where we get into the BARC scandal, which is recently been uncovered by the Mumbai police. But essentially, BARC is an industry body, and they have come up with a reliable and objective measure of how much television people across social demographics are watching, in particular to sort of estimate how many minutes of a particular TV channel they end up watching. And the way they do that is they create a representative sample of the country. I believe it's 50,000 families or households across the country, and they put sort of some kind of measuring mechanism in those TVs to track what they're watching. So what they've uncovered now is allegedly some sort of distribution agents working for the BARC in that last mile connectivity to the sample households were rigging the system so that certain news channels were disproportionately showed as being more TRP heavy as compared to others.
Just to clarify, so TRP, what does it really stand for? And so these minutes directly translate into revenue for the news channels, right?
They do translate into revenue. So TRP is basically like a measure of how many hits your TV program is getting.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, so think of it like rigging your exams so that you get the highest grades. And advertisers are looking at those grades to decide where they want to spend their advertising money. And the more you rig the grades, the higher your TRPs or grades are, and the more advertisers will spend on your channel versus a competitor. So if the whole BARC system falls apart, then honestly, the whole advertising model is probably rewarding incentives that may not reflect the viewership preferences of the country. That's why this is such a big sort of scandal.
I mean, it feels intuitive. Like, I don't know, maybe it's just me being a cynic, but one part of me is like, of course this is happening. It's a self-serving cycle. Advertisers invest in you. You want to consolidate that investment, so you produce content that sort of favors them as opposed to the people, and it keeps on happening.
Right.
But at the same time, it's also surprising. Like, how were they able to get away with this for so long? And you know what's happened to the news? It's happened right in front of our eyes. We've seen it play out in real time. The shift was very evident. So it's interesting that you said that this is a gradual problem because the law came into place back in 2004. Do you think that this is sort of going to act like a wake up call or motivate politicians or other actors to pick up their pace and do something about it? Like, what do you think the consequences of this scandal are?
So the one consequence that I'm actually worried about is that there will be hand wringing by these news channels to get the government involved. And I don't want to go down that slippery slope of having the government decide on appropriate content and how it's measured on television in a country like India, where there's anyway so much, to put it mildly, so much stress in our system of democracy at this point of time, where if you have the government involved in even this, and they are in other ways, like make no mistake, government is not completely blameless in this situation. They are involved in other ways, but to have them directly regulating television news content is a slippery slope I don't want to sign on to. So that's what I'm worried about. What I'm hopeful for, and we can get to that later, but I don't know, does that make sense? Government censorship in a country like India is just going to be disastrous.
I agree with you, and so I don't know how much of a stake this particular issue has in the larger problem, but I'm thinking so maybe it's true that younger people they're not really watching a lot of news on the TV, but older people definitely are. My relatives, my parents, my friends' parents, for all of them, their main source of information, maybe after the newspaper, is TV. And the thing is, they vote. Like, I can't vote yet. So that sort of means that if the government does end up controlling the narrative of what these people are watching and what information they're being fed, like you said, it does get very dangerous. And that's bipartisan. Like, regardless of whichever government is controlling the narrative, it's ultimately to reserve their powers. And it can dilute very easily into misinformation and sensationalization and provoking violence. And we have seen the worst of it play out. So, yeah, I think what you express is a very credible fear.
So where does the hope come from? I guess the hope comes from some kind of credibility restored to the BARC system. We're using that as a measure of who's doing well in the news media business. And by well, I don't mean covering the news, unfortunately. I mean who's being watched the most. So if there's some credibility restored to that system and we find out that actually people are really tuning out of the news channels and perhaps going to those few channels and there are a few that are actively trying to cover the news, then that means that advertisers will have to reevaluate who they're rewarding. And I think that our best hope for that is some kind of self-regulation within the industry. And I guess the issue is that they're just not accountable to anyone but themselves at this point of time. And maybe if there is a better system of measuring who's watching what, and if that system is independently audited periodically to make sure that it's that the integrity hasn't been compromised, then I think that a lot of advertisers will be able to base their decisions on credible information, because people are not watching this stuff, and people are watching it, but in the demographic of 18 to 35, I think there has been a drastic reduction, which is not being fully captured in these BARC metrics.
And I think it's definitely worth mentioning that what you are talking about has been taking shape. A lot of advertisers did pull out of certain channels because of the content or because of the scam that recently took place. And of course, channels are also being sued by the people they were sort of attacking. So it's they are not accountable to anyone but themselves, but there have been repercussions. And I wondered if that sort of is like a source of hope.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that the actions taken by the people who were slandered by the news media and they were slandered will hopefully promote some kind of introspection within these news channels. That alone would not do it, but I think that once it starts hitting your bottom line, then it's very hard to ignore the reality of what you're doing. So let's hope that a combination of these two forces like promote some kind of change within the media. But then I want to go back to the other sources of news that you mentioned, because it seems like at some point of time, not very long ago, these news channels and indeed newspapers in print form had a monopoly on distribution of content. That monopoly has been removed, let's say, over the last 10 years with the democratization of the internet and with its spread amongst the people of India. So at this point, anyone in the country with a cell phone can basically become a journalist and set up a YouTube account and start talking about the news. And that is a good thing for many reasons, because it puts constant pressure on the news media to evaluate its practices. And it also makes sure that news stories can't be hidden. The worry there is that they don't have the same resources as these news channels to actually vet the information they're putting out. And
Yeah, because they're funded by themselves, so they don't have any corporate donors or big industry influence.
precisely, and that's assuming they're acting in good faith. Some of them have dubious relationships with the truth, independent of their desire to be truthful. And some of them are just actively malicious, or actively trying to propagate falsehoods on social media. And to be quite honest, it's a trend that I've seen on the right. It's a trend I've seen on the left. It's pretty bipartisan in that sense.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So yeah, it's great that we have these independent news sources coming up, but they're not a perfect substitute for news distribution through television or through print.
Yeah, for sure. And I think true, honest media matters so much more than we may give it credit for, because it's not just telling us what's happening, but it's largely shaping the course of action both citizens and the representative stake, corporation stake, employers and employees stake. It's a force in of itself. We can't discount the impact the media has on the public and on policy. I guess what we've seen most recently is what could be a very healthy and extensive conversation about mental health, especially in men, especially with regards to addiction and drug abuse, has been turned into a sort of Bollywood gossip thing. And it was so disappointing, because we had the chance to have a very real conversation, because what the media does is that you watch it at home and the conversation starts at home, and then it becomes a structural systemic thing. And that just didn't happen. It turned into something, like you said, which is pretty ridiculous. So though independent channels cannot be a perfect substitute because of their limited reach and all the shortcomings you just mentioned, they definitely deserve a lot more attention, because some of them are genuinely trying to get good work out there, very fact-based, not based on sensationalization.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that the sources I mentioned before, I think the print is doing a really good job. Fi D'Souza is doing a really good job. There are plenty of others out there, and I don't want to list them all as if I'm endorsing them, but a lot of them, begin their YouTube videos by saying, if you want good journalism, then please pay for it. And I completely endorse that view. I think that as consumers of the news, we have to reward good practices. And right now, we don't have a say in what we're getting to see on television, because it's just thrown at us and we watch it anyway. But perhaps we can sort of, find a way to support people who are actually doing good work, independent of television. And by the way, there are good people on both sides of the political spectrum. So I'm not making a sort of an endorsement of, left-leaning, anti-government sources.
Yeah, definitely.
Support either side, just support independent journalists in general. I think is that would be my sort of individual recommendation for people who are very concerned about what they see when they open the primetime news channels at 9 p.m.
Yeah, I think you've put that very well. News is supposed to be a conversation. It's supposed to be influenced by what the public wants to see, and it's supposed to be informative and true and helpful and nuanced. And what we're seeing is sort of that being dissolved, but it does eventually come down to the consumer as well, because that is who advertisers cater to. So I guess when we as consumers realize that we have the right to good content, it's up to us to exercise that right and explore channels and sources that benefit that.
Not only do we have the right to it, but we have the ability to influence it. So I think consumer decisions to uh, can indeed influence the content quality that we consume. So, on that note, let's go into our segment of media recommendations or TV show recommendations and film recommendations. What have you been watching, Rishika, lately?
You go first. I think I have to narrow down my options because I have a lot in mind.
Sounds good. So, the media recommendation that I have for this episode is actually correlated to the theme that we discussed in the episode itself, and that's a coincidence. I recently watched this TV show called Scam 1992, which is directed by Hansal Mehta and has sort of covered the story of a stock market rigging scam of the early 1990s involving a notorious financier called Harshad Mehta. Uh, it is an extremely well made show because it covers a very complicated set of financial transactions in a very consumable and entertaining way. The performances are pretty stellar. But the one aspect of it that I do want to spotlight is the role of two investigative journalists within that Harshad Mehta story who have been portrayed in the show also, and they're Sucheta Dalal and Devashish Basu. So they actually wrote a book on this saga called The Scam, on which this show is based. And they were the ones who sort of chased this story, uncovered it, and brought it to light. And to put it mildly, when I draw contrast between the work that happened then and now, it's like night and day. And as an Indian consumer of news, it just made me very proud to see, good journalism in action, even if it was on the screen or happened 30 years ago. And I hope that people who are young and in journalism can draw inspiration from that, because when this story came out, these two journalists were only in their late 20s or early 30s. I forget exactly, but very young, upcoming journalists. Really shaking the trees of powerful people in India, and I encourage all of you to check the show out.
That sounds really interesting. This has been on my to watch list, but I'm definitely going to get to it. I think, I don't remember exactly what year it was. I think this was 2018, where Times named journalists as their person of the year because of their commitment to the truth and all the work they do. And that kind of segues into my media recommendation. My media recommendation is like more broad, and it's a magazine, a publication called The Caravan. I will say it is admittedly left leaning, but if I would suggest checking it out because the work they do is incredible. Another reason why I recommend them is because recently a journalist at the Caravan, Ahan Penkar, who was a 24-year-old staffer, he was reporting in North Delhi and was assaulted by the police. And it really raises questions about the nature of free press in India, because I personally believe that, and what we've really discussed is that independent news outlets are sort of the future of good reporting, unless current news outlets don't change their course. So I would suggest checking them out on their socials. A lot of their work is available on their website. And yeah, so I think my broad media recommendation would be the Caravan magazine. And of course, if you can subscribe to the magazine itself, please do so. But I'm also open to recommendations along the same lines from the other side of the political spectrum, because it's so important to diversify the kind of news we consume and balance out the opinions that we allow to influence us. So, if you do feel we're being biased in this regard, I am always open to new recommendations.
All right, Rishka, on that note, that concludes it.
Yeah, perfect. It was great getting to talk about this with you. Thank you so much to our listeners for listening. We've been really happy with the progress we've been making in the podcast, and we have some really, really exciting stuff come up. The next month is going to be full of some really cool content, and I don't want to reveal too much, but Yeah, it's there's some good releases, and I can't wait for the world to see them, because we sort of worked on this together, and it's nice to see it come to fruition. So please share the episode if you found it interesting, and of course, if you have any suggestions, feel free to write to us. Thank you to our listeners. We hope you stay safe and take care, and we'll see you next time.